Ethiopia is today not entirely a Muslim country, thanks to the Oromo people, not the Portuguese. Of course, the Portuguese played some role, but ultimately it was the Oromo people who stopped the spread of Islam in Ethiopia. And the area we know today as the Horn of Africa is one of the areas that Islam came to very early on, and by 13th century, 14th century, the religion of Islam had spread extensively in that area. But Ethiopia kind of stood in the way. Of course, the other side of Ethiopia, we have Sudan and then Egypt. Those parts became Islamized, but Ethiopia remained in the middle. And Ethiopia, of course, was a Christian nation for a very long time, for thousands of years. And when Islam comes, Ethiopia remains in the middle as a Christian nation. Of course, there is a push to Islamize it. Now, the major push to make Ethiopia an Islam country came from what is known as the Adal Sultanate. Now, the Adal Sultanate is this sultanate that emerged to the west or southwest of Ethiopia in what maybe could be Eritrea or Djibouti and some part of Somalia. That area, and in fact, the majority of the citizens of this sultanate, it was primarily Somali, Afar, and Harari, and some Arabs. So it was a mixture of people from different parts. Now, the Adal Sultanate emerged from another sultanate that existed before it, and that is the sultanate that used to be called the Ifat. Now, the Ifat Sultanate spread into the area that became the Adal Sultanate from early 13th century, and it conquered that area. And even the Ifat Sultanate had a lot of issues with the Ethiopian Empire, the Abyssinian Empire, as it used to be called then. And there were a lot of wars between the Abyssinian Empire and the Ifat Sultanate. And these wars went on, and oftentimes the Ethiopians will come to the Ifat Sultanate and they will raid it. And for the most part, they were the ones who were successful. There was a time in 1332 when the Ifat Sultanate was invaded by an Ethiopian emperor who went by the name of Amda Seyon I, and he went all the way and ravaged the entire land, and then he left. And these wars happened so many times, these invasions. At this point, it was mostly from Ethiopia to the region known as Ifat. Now, at some point, the Ethiopians managed to capture the leader of the Ifat Sultanate, a guy who went by the name Saad ad-Din II, and they executed him. And the rest of his government and his family in particular, they escaped and they went to Yemen. And they stayed there for a while until his son came back, whose name was Sabr ad-Din III, his eldest son. He came back to that region, and it is said that he is the one who established the Adal Sultanate. But of course, the war with the Muslims in that area and the Abyssinian Empire went on. It was a common occurrence between these two nations who were neighbors, but they were of different religions. And so that became, of course, there was, in particular, the Adal Sultanate had a policy of trying to spread Islam, of course. So that became a huge issue between the two. And in fact, the Ethiopians basically declared Adal to be their foremost enemy, because the Adal Sultanate wanted to convert Ethiopia into a Muslim country. But there was a final push where now things reached to the point where one of the two had to fall, either Abyssinian Empire or the Adal Sultanate. And at this point, the Adal Sultanate had grown so much. This is a few hundred years after it being reestablished, we can say. And this is around early 16th century. And now there is this push by Adal to go to Ethiopia and to conquer it. Now, there is one man who took it so personal and wanted to capture or to conquer Ethiopia, and his name was Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. This Imam is often called different names. Sometimes he's called Gran or Gurey. But yeah, his official names were Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. He was, of course, the leader of Adal at some point, especially beginning early 16th century. He came to power in Adal, and he decides that he's going to go to Ethiopia and conquer Ethiopia and Islamize it. And in fact, he puts together an army that comprises mostly of course, Afar, Harari, and Somali, and some Arabs within the Sultanate. But he also gets support from Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a fact that is often not mentioned when you hear people talk about the war between Ethiopia and Adal. Most people talk of there were outside forces that came and, of course, changed how the war went. But often people talk of Portuguese, but people hardly talk of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire provided the weaponry that the Adal soldiers were going to use against the Ethiopians. So while the Adal had Turkish support, or we can call it Ottoman Empire support. Of course, the Ethiopians did get support from the Portuguese, and now that is often what is mentioned. But both sides, when you consider that the Adal got the support of the Ottoman Empire and the Ethiopians got the support of the Portuguese, then we can say it balances out. Both groups had external support. Now, on the side of the Ethiopians, of course, there were the Amhara, Tigrayans, Tigrinya, Ago people, and of course, the Portuguese who come very late. And this war ended up being called the Ethiopian-Adal War. And this war starts around 1529 and it ended in 1543. Now, this is the war that defines what becomes Ethiopia and how Ethiopia remains to be a Christian nation to date. We can say not really Christian nation because there's a huge population that is of Islam, but basically that's how Ethiopia retained its Christian base as a nation to date. The war, of course, starts with Ahmad bin Ibrahim al-Ghazi putting together this army and, of course, marching on towards Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it used to be called then. And in fact, he has a lot of success. The Ethiopians have no chance against this guy. This guy was efficient. He was a military strategist. He was so good. And he walks through the land all the way to the headquarters of Abyssinia, and he ransacks the churches and destroys property and forces people to convert to Islam. And in fact, very many people did convert to Islam. And he's doing all that, and is so successful. It looked like Ethiopia was done, basically. Ethiopia, at least as a Christian nation. But then the Portuguese appear. The Portuguese come and they help the Ethiopians. They provide them with weapons and they join their ranks. And then they fight. And it is through the help of the Portuguese, of course, which is a known story, that the Ethiopians managed to push Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. In fact, he ends up being killed in that war and he dies, and then other people took over, of course, the leadership of the Adal Sultanate. Now, here is where the Oromo people come in, and people will say, yeah, the Portuguese did this work or this job of providing the Ethiopians with the weapons and the support, and that is what made Ethiopia to remain to be Ethiopia or Abyssinia. But you need to bear in mind that, as I've mentioned, the Adal Sultanate did have support from the Ottoman Empire. And there's no way you are going to believe that them going back to Adal meant that the war was going to be over. They were going to regroup, they were going to rethink of their strategy. And in fact, the Ethiopians and the Portuguese did not pursue them all the way. They just let them leave. It looks like all they wanted was them to leave Ethiopia or Abyssinia, and they left. And now they go back to Adal, of course. If the Oromos did not intervene, I believe that the Adal Sultanate would have emerged again, maybe more powerful, and it would have likely come back to Ethiopia and likely conquer it. Now, here is what happens. Now they go back, they are so weak, but now the Oromo people start moving, migrating from the south. Now they are migrating, and now the Oromo at the end surrounds the entire Adal, or to a large extent, the large extent of Adal Empire or Adal Sultanate, and they started fighting them. And at some point, the people of Adal were forced to sign what has been described to be a humiliating treaty with the Oromos. And that treaty, basically, after that, the Adal Sultanate basically died. So yeah, while the Portuguese played a major role in helping the Ethiopians push out the Adal army out of Ethiopia and even kill their leader, it is the Oromo who basically put the last nail on the coffin, so to say, and the Adal Sultanate died. Those are my random thoughts.